Okay, so Jay, we spoke offline for a moment about buyer agency, or what you might call loyalty agreements, and why they're important and what type of a benefit they can provide to both the realtor and the client consumer.
Yeah, so we did, and I think there's a fear out there. At least what I find. I find that a lot of people are afraid to even bring up the word buyer broker agreement or loyalty agreement or have somebody sign a contract. And I think as an industry, maybe it's just a culture. I think we're afraid to talk about money. I think we're it's difficult for us to bring up compensation, let alone an agreement that binds. And I'm saying that word intentionally because I think a lot of agents are afraid of binding their client to a contract. Yet they do it if they take a listing. So I think the fear is that there's no fear really other than what you had mentioned, which was rejection. But if no one's ever talked to you about it, taught you how to, get an agreement, why it's important to get an agreement and what the benefit is to the seller or to the buyer as to you, but also coach and train on objection handling and, rejection of no, Jay, I've never signed that. I don't ever want to sign that. And so I think that's a big fear of why agents don't get it. Because I told you, right? They say this. They say, well, all I always work with is referrals, so I don't need it. If they don't want to work with me, I don't want to work with them. And that was my cop out early in my career why I didn't want to get the buyer broker. And my reason was no one taught me how to do it. And it was just scary, right? So I needed that buyer to pay my mortgage payment. And the last thing I wanted to do was to upset the apple cart and have that guy walk up and get out of the room because I presented a buyer broker agreement. And rarely does that ever happen. I think it's one time it ever happened to me. And that was actually my fault. But my point there is that once you get used to the fact that a contract is a binding agreement between a buyer broker or a listing agent and a seller and a buyer, you get really comfortable about asking for it. So I think the fear of, for instance, number one is I've worked with all these people in the past as referrals. How can I now go back to the person I sold 5 houses to and ask now for an agreement, right? So that was one of the objections or one of the concerns. But the concern of putting in front of a buyer a contract is real. Like I've had agents literally sweating and shaking to do that. So, but they have no issue doing it when it comes to a listing, which is kind of funny to me. So,
I think that's because it just hasn't been practiced.
It's the industry norm and standard to get a listing agreement. It's not an industry norm and standard to get a buyer broker agreement. So,
and now that things are changing, I think this will actually work to everyone's benefit because they'll have to put it into practice. And I love that you call them loyalty agreements because why wouldn't you have that? If you're going out there and you're representing someone and you're now opening it up to all different types of listings, and I think we talked about this in our last session, where you're not only showing listings that are on MLS, you're not only showing, you can now show for sale by owners, and you can also go out and hunt for a new listing to sell to your buyer. So at that point, why wouldn't you have an agreement?
Again, I think it's fear. I think the fear is that I've never had to do it in the past. And to your point, Victoria, I think you're right. Once it becomes a standard and you're not a contrarian out there doing it, different than anybody else, it will be much easier. But I do think that there will be a lot of real estate agents who still reject the fact that they have to get one signed because they don't know the benefit to the client versus when I talk to agents about getting a buyer broker loyalty agreement, they're like, yeah, I don't want to take anybody to court. I go, it has nothing to do with somebody to court.
Right.
If you have to, you could.
I think it goes back to knowing your value. What is my skill and what is the dollar amount that's attached to that skill?
Correct.
And if I can articulate that value to my client.
Yep.
Right. Well, in a professional setting, you'd think that there's a plumber either charges or gets the job or not. But I think on the other side of the fear you're talking about with the realtors not wanting to get an agreement is they have an alternative. If you go for a listing, it's black or white, get it or don't. In the buyer side, you can avoid that position where a buyer may say no, and then form a relationship. I like him, her, we're doing great. We talk about kids and stuff and local, who knows who, my friend knows you, and you might like the house. People use the house as the attraction. And if we're all in alignment, you need this house, we got to get you this house. Then there's such a relationship. You hear, we're relationship based. We don't need a contract. And you know what? That's right. Relationships are paramount. We know that. But I'm just bringing out the point. It's not a black or white scenario. There are alternatives to getting a buyer agency agreement because people want the house. They want the house more than they want to be related to you, and people can rely on that house.
Well,
Scott, you bring up a really good point there. You say, we're talking about relationship business, and it has always been a relationship business. And people, we all know, do business with whom they like and trust.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think now that things are changing, that this would become more of a transactional business? Maybe working on that hourly basis or that variable commission, or even if it's a percentage with a contract on both sides. Do you think that maybe we're going to kind of pull away from that relationship? Because fiduciary is a word that we're throwing around all the time, right? All of us are fiduciaries. Maybe that will change as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Victoria, we've spoken about that. I want to run by Jay as well, which really leads into his training, how to overcome these obstacles and really provide the best benefit. Of course, the service industry, professional services, we pride ourselves on relationships, whether it's referral partners or clients themselves. To me, relationships really matter when everyone can do the job. When we have, let's say, your electrician, you love the guy, calls you back right on the spot. You have a great relationship. He gets what he needs done. Mm-hmm. But I had a relationship. I should say, a situation where I had a bad oral problem. I needed the dentist. He took care of me. That's purely transactional. We don't do dentistry every day. So I think that because whether lending these days or real estate representation and compensation, the menu of services can be all over the board, and the compensation is going to differ greatly. I think that this scenario, this arrangement, will be far more transactional, where who can represent me from the client side and who is the best ideal client for me from the professional side. It may be that based on the services offered, payment can be, as I said, commensurate. I think that there doesn't need to be a love affair or lovey-dovey and friends and Facebook friends. I don't think that relationships matter anymore because we all can't do the job. Before, property was on MLS. I found you the property. I can show you the property. Now, if a property is not on MLS, I can do much more for you. You might want to hire me as a specialist, as a
You're in
tactician.
agreement that this is being pulled away from the relationship business and moving more toward the transaction?
Yeah, far more. I think relationships only matter when everyone is capable. In this case, very few agents are going to be able to navigate this buyer agent representation and compensation environment, and only the best can demand the most income, and there may still be a disconnect. I mean, maybe someone doesn't want superior service, and maybe they want the lowest level, and that's fine. There's Walmart, and then there's Nordstrom's. We all know about that, and I think that relationship seekers are going to be left because the tacticians will be able to demonstrate their value and provide results far in greater supply.
How do you teach that, Jay? How do you teach an agent to transition from that relationship and really look more toward the transactional? And then after you answer that, I really want to jump into the fiduciary responsibilities as well.
Yeah. So I spent 22 years in the car business, and I became very transactional, right? Because it was usually a 5-year purchase or 3 or 4-year purchase. And if they didn't like the car after the end of the 3 or 4 years, I was only selling one type of car. They didn't come back to me, right? So I became very transactional. What I realized in real estate, though, is that relationship is marketing. That's all that is. It's a marketing fodder to get people to raise their hand and say, I want to buy and sell. That's all relationships are. Now, I'm not saying relationships don't continue to feed you business, because just like marketing, if you continue to nurture and continue to do it, it does. But how do you take, I'm gonna put my hands up, how do you take transactional and you mold it together with relationship is going to be the question where a lot of agents are going to get stuck, because they're only relationship. And you're absolutely right. The tactician's going to be eating their lunch, unfortunately, because even though I have 15 or 20 people singing my praises, if I'm letting a listing agent dictate my income, because that's what's happening if you don't get a loyalty agreement or buy agreement, regardless if I can do the job well, I'm not getting paid what I want. And so I'm not going to be a good steward of that relationship if I'm not getting compensated as much as I feel like I'm worth. And I can't blame anybody else except me if I'm not articulating what my value is and then asking for that in return from a compensation standpoint. So The reason I bring up the loyalty agreement and the reason I use the loyalty agreement is I like the fact that it's loyalty, right? I'm not asking anything other than your loyalty. I just don't want you to run off to an open house and go buy a house with somebody else if you're using me, right? So the training on that basically is you have to use relationship as a marketing system within your business. No different than farming postcards or flyers or online leads. It doesn't matter. That's a relationship as part of marketing. But you still have to be very good at making sure that that relationship is secured by compensation. And that is, as to what your points are, very difficult for a lot of agents because they've never had to do that. So when agents start to bellyache because they've worked with this person for years, sold them multiple houses, they go out and show them 10 houses, they make an offer and they look down, they see that it's offering them a very, very, very tiny commission from a buyer or from a listing agent. I just shrug my shoulders and say, shame on you. You worked all that time and effort and energy, and you didn't have the capacity or the knowledge to actually set your fee. I guarantee you'll never do that again.
So how do you build that skill?
Role play, understanding the concept of what buyer compensation is, understanding that you as an agent, this is my conversation, are a valuable piece to this process, right? When I was in the car business back in 1993, when the internet came out, all these car salesmen were like, oh my God, we're going to go extinct because everybody's going to buy cars on the internet. And while people still buy cars on the internet, 82% of all car sales are still done at the broker or at the dealership level, right? So you can still build. We're not going to go extinct. People will still use an agent, whether it's a buyer's agent or a listing agent, to conduct a transaction of this magnitude. But if you don't build your value and tell people why you're special, what makes you unique, different than other agents, you can be similar, but you have to be different in a way that gets them to say, okay, if I know you and like you and trust you, and you're the agent that all of my friends use, I don't really have to sell you that hard to use me. But if I don't know you, if I'm an internet lead and you just call me and I'm just looking for houses, and all of a sudden you want to start building this rapport with me, I have no idea who you are. So it's building the relationship from scratch. I teach everybody that I don't care if that person's your 10-year best friend, you still treat them and you still court them as if they're a brand new lead that you don't know. And that's a skill that a lot of agents
have. The same way you would do if it were a listing.
Exactly. Same way if you do as a listing, you'd have to court that listing. And so, and you have to make sure you don't fall down on every step. And so that's the hard part is for a lot of agents is the shift. I always say it's the 6 to 8 inches between their ears that tells them they can't do it.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really a mind shift.
It is.
A mindset shift for sure.
Once they understand their value, though, they shift pretty fast.
Yeah, I want to talk about fiduciary now because now you're talking about we're still building a relationship to some degree, but it is becoming a little bit more transactional. But we do have a fiduciary responsibility based on the license that we have. So how? Number one, first and foremost, why are we fiduciaries? I'd like to ask that question. And then 2, how do we handle that now if we're moving in a direction of transactional?
Well, I'll leave the why up to Scott because that's probably his forte. But I would say that handling what we handle, at least here in Arizona, we handle a lot of the paperwork. We handle a lot of the process. With that responsibility is a lot of liability, right? So, insurance gets attacked every year because of frivolous lawsuits. Errors and omissions is a real thing. People do have errors and they do have omissions and things like that do happen. So I think the idea of being a fiduciary for somebody, at least from what I understand and what I see here, is taken pretty seriously. But I don't know how that's going to look in the future. That'll be very interesting to see.
Well, I mean, there's always this inherent contradiction where a fiduciary, which is is defined as someone who's putting their client's interests above their own, compared to a salesperson who's in this just to make the sale. I don't know how the compensation was ever tied to from a sale to a fiduciary. That's a conundrum. I think that legislation, state, nationwide and individually state generated, used the fact that agency law control. They just really took a loose working on behalf of someone as principal and agency relationship, and that if vicarious liability and the Latin respondeat superior, where brokers are responsible for agents and agents must act in the best interest of the client. You can speak about getting a lower price, which hurts the broker's commission and helps only a little bit the buyer and hurts the seller the most.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the crux of the problem with the clear cooperation policy, because the sellers paid more than they would have had the buyer's agent went to the open market and got services. It got unpaid for services rationally, so to speak. So we're here to provide agents the methods to be able to duplicate or even increase or enhance their compensation as we discuss doing more and more and better services.